is an even stronger belief in that happening. Of course, with the war in Ukraine, this has now become imaginable in a different way than it was only a short time ago. With 55% thinking it's likely and only 21% thinking it's unlikely that we'll see a new war in Europe. And then finally, we asked also whether people think that that war could also spread to Norwegian territory, whether we could actually see armed conflict on Norwegian territory within 10 years. The majority still thinks that that's unlikely. 43% thinks it's unlikely, although relatively small portion, only 8% think it's very unlikely, and as many as 26% think that it's actually likely that we could see armed conflict on Norwegian territory in the next 10 years. We also asked, and we'll cover this in this session as well, whether democracy is in decline in the world. This is also of interest for conflict researchers, because we know that democracies are less likely to be involved in conflict with other democracies, but also less likely to have internal armed conflict. This is a relatively bleak picture, with only 13% disagreeing that democracy is in decline in the world, and as many as 58% believing that we are seeing a decline in democracy. And we'll also return to the actual facts in the next presentations. So, are there reasons to be concerned? Do people have a fairly accurate idea about what we're seeing on the ground? To get us off the ground with global conflict trends, I'll ask Sigrid Alsegustad, Research Director at PRIO and also head of the Conflict Trends Project, to take us through the actual facts on the ground. Please, Sigrid. Oh, sorry. Small detail. We also asked, and this is important, of course, whether we are equipped, whether the international community is equipped to deal with the situation, and this is important. We asked whether institutions and organizations for maintaining world peace, such as the United Nations, are less powerful than they were before. And as you can see, only 12% think that this is inaccurate, and the vast majority agree that the world institutions are less powerful today than they were short time ago. So this is the situation. This is the perceptions among the Norwegian populations: more conflict, more violent conflict, less democracy, and we're less equipped to deal with this situation than we were only a short time ago. So then we'll go to Sigrid and the global conflict trends. Please, Sigrid.
Okay, so we use data from the Uppsala University data program on where they count conflicts and count people killed in conflict. And this is what it looks like since 1946 until 2023. Since I haven't been allotted too much time, I'll try to keep to the right hand of the graph. But a couple of things that's worth noting. We see the vast majority of conflicts in the world are civil wars. So that's the beige and the blue. The blue is what we call internationalized civil wars. These are civil wars, or internal conflicts in a country, but where you have a third party intervening, often a third state or outside state that supports the government. And we see that has increased vastly in the past decade. So that's an important thing. But if you look at 2023, it is the highest number of counted conflicts since 1946, 59 conflicts. 9 of these are what we call wars, which means they reach more than 1,000 killed within a year. Also, we see there has been an increase since around 2012. And the reason we see this increase is that this is when Islamic State became more world organization. So a lot of Islamic organization in conflict, in civil wars, pledge allegiance to IS, and suddenly IS became an actor in conflicts all around the world, from West Africa to Philippines and Bangladesh. So at its height, IS were involved in 16 countries around the world. And if we had sort of, and also these conflicts were already ongoing conflicts, so they didn't start new conflicts. So for example, in Nigeria, they kind of became part of the Boko Haram conflict, but still there were separate parts, and there were conflicts between Boko Haram and IS. But if we sort of take out all of these IS conflicts, we actually would have been around here. So it would actually look quite stable. Now we know that IS have become weaker in the past few years, and we know that in 2023 we only had 12 IS conflicts. But what we also see is that there are other Islamic groups now becoming more transnational. So you have the same group fighting more governments, especially in West Africa. So that's for the number of conflicts. But this black line indicates number of battle deaths. And what is counted here and is reported are people killed in conflict action. It doesn't mean it's only combatants, it also includes civilians, but it's not the indirect deaths. So it's not people dying from starvation due to conflicts, it's people killed in actual fighting. And as you see, in sort of most of the 2000s were quite peaceful compared to the 70s and 60s and 80s, but then something happens here. And we actually see that the 3 past years, 2021, 2022, and 2023, were the 3 most bloody years since 1989. So what's the reason for this? Is the world becoming unhinged? Now we know that there's, we get these bloody conflicts occasionally. They rise, you know. This is the Eritrea-Ethiopia conflicts. We have Sri Lanka conflict. We have Syria. But what happens in the past 3 years is that we get several of these really bloody conflicts at the same time, and they're sort of taking over for each other. So we have Afghanistan when the Taliban took over. We have Yemen. We have Ethiopia. We have Ukraine. We have Gaza. And the question is this a trend or is it a coincidence? Because they don't really have anything to do with each other sort of superficially. We didn't see an invasion in Gaza or the bombing of Gaza because there's a conflict in Ukraine, right? So we don't know if this is a trend. But what it does is that it creates more tension among greater powers. You get competition among resources to the conflict areas and also attention. And that, again, can lead to systematic new trends. What is kind of ironic, or what this data show us, is that, yes, the people's perception is right. There are more conflicts, and there are more people killed. The irony here, if you can call it that, 2021 and 2022, which are the worst years since the Cold War, were caused by a conflict that most people don't know about. And that's the civil war in Ethiopia, in the Tigray region. In these 2 years, more people killed, at least, and these estimates are conservative. More people were killed in this conflict than all of Afghanistan since 1989. And almost as many as the 13 years of civil war in Syria. And we don't really know about it. And still we feel that more people are being killed. And that has to do with attention and what the media reports and what we know about. So yes, the polls are right, but it's not necessarily as easy as that. A country can have more conflicts, because what we count are conflict actors. So as I said, in Nigeria, both IS and Boko Haram are in conflict with the state. So that means that this graph shows this is the number of conflicts. This is the same sort of what I just showed you. But these bars are conflict countries. And what is clear is that when in around 2013, 2012, when we see this increase, we don't really see the same increase among conflict countries. Partly because IS went into countries where there were already conflict. So we don't see, they didn't spread to new areas. But also in 2023, it went down from 39 to 34 conflict countries, even though we had more number of conflicts in the world. And what that means is that these conflict countries have more conflict. They become more complex. No, sorry, well, that was not what I was supposed to. This is the same graph. I've just added a line, a trend line, showing the share of these conflict countries that has more than one conflict. And we see from around 2015, 50% of the conflict countries has more than one conflict. And in fact, in 2023, 7 of them had more than 3. What that indicates is that it's becoming more complex and more difficult. There's more actors, which means that this is becoming more difficult to solve. So not only is it more conflict in the world, it's also more complex conflicts. Good.
Thank you very much, Sigrid. And now we're going to go to the question of whether we can expect things to stay as they are. PRIO has a large early warning prediction system called VIEWS, and I'll turn to Paula Vesco, one of our senior researchers on that project, to take us through what we think we can say about the future. Paula.
Thanks. Yes, so Siri has mentioned trends, and so when navigating this complex crisis, the ability to anticipate the future would enable us to provide more, better and earlier relief to the affected population, and as a result, mitigate human suffering. And this is why we have developed and continue to improve VIEWS, the Violence and Impact Early Warning System. I'm Paula Vesco, and I'm a senior researcher at PRIO and also the deputy director of VIEWS. What is VIEWS? It is an academic consortium jointly hosted by Uppsala University and the Peace Research Institute Oslo. We started in 2017, and since then we have continuously improved this early warning system. So we leverage UCDP data that Siri discussed, and we provide forecasts for all over the world every month up to 3 years into the future. So what we predict is the risk, but also the number of fatalities related to armed conflict. And I will present the details in a minute. As you see, we are now a big consortium. So we not only are hosted by Uppsala and PRIO, but we also engage with a dozen research institutes all over the world. And the purpose of this is to gain insight on the future of political violence, but also to analyze the impacts of armed conflict on a range of societal domains. So we know that armed conflict, unfortunately, has a lot of impacts on food security, migration, displacement, economic conditions, and health. But we do not really know scientifically how all these impacts interact. So one of the goals of the project is also to be able to forecast in a few years what are the expected impacts of the armed conflict on these societal domains. But so far, I'm presenting what we are doing right now and know what's coming. So we leverage the findings from decades of empirical literature on what is a possible driver of conflict. And we use those inputs to predict state-based armed conflict. And with this, I mean the conflict that involves at least one government actor. We're also expanding these predictions to include other types of violence in the future. So we are going to include also non-state conflicts and one-sided violence. We forecast every month, and we actually publish a newsletter to keep you all informed every month on what's happening or what's the expected risk of conflict up to 3 years into the future. And we cover the world at the country level, so we provide a forecast for every country in the world, but we also provide more granular forecasts that I will show you in a minute, for Africa and the Middle East, but we plan to expand this forecast, more granular forecast, at the subnational level to the world next year. We recently released a data dashboard that enables the users to easily visualize our forecasts and navigate what we predict. So this is an example of our dashboard. And on top, you see what we predicted in terms of subnational forecasts for an example case, but we also provide, so these are called grid cells, and they are around 55 by 55 kilometers. And for now, we only provide this type of forecast for Africa and Middle East. We also, so we provide different formats of forecast. One is the probability that an event reaches or crosses the 25 deaths in a country and in a given year. But because we realized that for the decision maker, it's not only important to have an estimate or a forecast of the probability of conflict, we were also the first research institute or program to start predicting the number of deaths. Because one death, every death matters, of course, but maybe it's more important for the decision maker to understand if a conflict escalates or de-escalates, and a little bit about the expected magnitude of the conflict. So this is another outcome that we forecast now every month, and we also forecast the de-escalation or escalation trends that are expected compared to the recent history of conflict. So I will not have time to explain how the models work or are constructed. Now, for the interest of time, I will just present an example of what we think may happen in the future. So is the world becoming more violent? And what is the forecast for the next few months? On the left, you see what we predict for November this year for Israel. So although we predict a substantial number of fatalities for the fall in Israel, and this number, so it's around 800 fatalities, remember that these numbers are quite conservative because they're based on UCDP data, and we know that UCDP tends to be conservative. But if you see what we expect to happen in the next few months is a de-escalation. And so we expect the conflict in Israel to de-escalate down to 0 fatalities in 2027. So that's at least what our models say. However, we also see a potential risk of a regional contagion effect. And with this, I mean, on the left, you see represented the change that we expect to happen in 2025, so 1 year from now, compared to the history of conflict. And what we see is that even previously or relatively stable countries in North Africa, they are not colored in the map because they're very low risk. But we expect that many countries in Middle East and also Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and some of these countries in North Africa that have been relatively stable in the past years have a non-negligible risk of at least 1 fatality. And this is probably because we know that why the conflict in one country affects the probability of and the stability of the neighboring region. Particularly concerning is the escalation that we predict in Iran. So we see still low numbers of fatalities, but quite concerning that we predict an upward trend in fatalities in Iran starting in 2025. And with this, I leave the word to Henrik, and thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Paula, and we will be able to go into some of the uses of this early warning model in the discussion. Now I'll turn to Marianne for the last presentation on global democracy trend. Marianne Urdal is also senior researcher and research director at PRIO. So please, Marianne, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm here to talk about patterns of democracy. I'll just start straight away with this graph. What this graph shows you is the average level of for countries on the polarity score, which is a score measuring the level of democracy in the country, ranging from 0 to 1, where 1 is a perfect democracy and 0 is a perfect autocracy. The big takeaway from this graph is the world today is far more democratic than it was at the beginning of the 1900s. We have seen 3 democratic waves, the first one starting with the end of the First World War, the second one with the end of the Second World War, and the third one starting in the 1970s already, but then escalating with the end of the Cold War. There's a lot of discussion in academia, in the media, about the current autocratic wave. And when you see here at the end, you see a tiny dip. You also see the shaded area, which are the confidence intervals, and just shows you how certain we are about the scores for each country. And when you take the confidence interval or the uncertainty into account, we don't see any market, any difference. And you might wonder, what's the fuss about? Are we only exaggerating this ongoing autocratic wave? But we see it much more clearly when we look at the red line here. So the red line, it shows you average countries weighted by population. So it means that instead of showing you the average country, it shows you the average type of system, no, the system the average citizen of the globe is currently living under. And we see this is a much bigger decline than what the green line shows you. And this reflects the fact that the ongoing autocratic wave is happening in countries with big populations, which means that it's simply much more important for the population of the globe what happens in India and Brazil than what happens in small countries like Norway and Iceland. Okay, so the ongoing autocratic wave, it roots back to the beginning of the 1990s. Already in the beginning of the 1990s, did we start to see an increase in the number of countries autocratizing. At the time, the democratic wave, the number of countries democratizing, was just so much greater, so we didn't really notice it. And it wasn't until 2013 that the number of countries autocratizing surpassed the number of countries democratizing. But since then, for every single year, there have been more countries autocratizing than countries democratizing. So we have seen waves of autocratization before, but these have typically been marked by these swift changes carried out through coups, often happening almost overnight. The current wave is a little bit different. So it often the most common type of autocratization that we see are these executive takeovers. So the incumbent himself, Bolsonaro, Morsi, gradually taking over power, building down the democratic systems in their country, often happening slowly over several election systems, which means that they can be punished by voters, but often they are not. And this is happening in democracies and autocracies. So democracies turning into autocracies, or autocracies becoming more autocratic. It's happening in all regions in the world, and the most common type we see are these semi-democracies, not fully democracies, that are turning into these semi-autocracies. There are some indications that this autocratic wave is declining, but it's far too early to conclude. Okay, so how do we change this? So an incredibly important source of democratic change has been nonviolent mass mobilization across the globe. People taking to the streets, demanding that the autocracy ends and that democracy is implemented. So what's a little bit puzzling is that we currently find ourselves not only in an autocratic wave, but also in a wave of mass mobilization. So the last decade, we have seen more mobilization than we have before. And that's a bit strange, because we know from research spanning political science, economics, and sociology that these nonviolent mass mobilization significantly increases the likelihood of democratic change. So if you take two countries that are similar on other variables, and one has episodes of mass mobilization and the other one doesn't, we're much more likely to see democratic change in the one that has mass mobilization. So how do these two waves coexist? There are many ways they can do so, But one possibility is that the effect of mass mobilization on democratic change has changed over time. So what we have done here is that we have estimated the effect of mass mobilization on democratic changes over time. And what we see is that it kind of ebbs and flows up until the beginning of the 1980s. It's not before the beginning of the 1980s that we start seeing this positive and significant effect on democratic change. And this effect, it lasts until about 2013, when we start seeing the wave of autocratization. So this means that if we could figure out how we can reinvigorate these movements, that's an easy question, but not with a simple solution. That's one way that we could halt or even end the autocratic wave. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And I'm going to ask the panel to come up. And we are very fortunate to also have State Secretary Andreas Motzfeldt Kravik with us today. He's going to get all the tough questions about how we solve this. So if you can please take the floor, Andreas and also the presenters. And I would like to start with you, Andreas. One of the hard questions here is, and we showed the last slide that I showed was demonstrating the concern in the Norwegian population about whether we are equipped to deal with what we're seeing now is a trend towards more conflict, but also less democracy. Even though there are, it's not a totally bleak picture, but there are some trends here that we're seeing that we are concerned about, and that the Norwegian population has recognized and certainly is very much on their mind and on everyone's mind these days. So sort of starting us off with trying to say something about whether, from your perspective, from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, whether the international security architecture that we have today is fit for dealing with the current challenges that we're seeing.
Right, exactly. Well, that's a really tough question, and I'll see if I can respond. But I just want to start by complimenting the researchers for providing us with really interesting data, and I think this is just testimony to PRIO's ability to provide, again, interesting data and also data which is important for us to work with and try to formulate effective policies on. So thank you very much. That was really, really fascinating. I should also thank you, Henrik, for the first slides that you showed us, and I thought it was pretty remarkable to see how Norwegians are pretty, they seem to be pretty up to date about the current trend lines and where things stand in terms of the fact that we see an uptick in conflicts, we see more authoritarian states emerging, we see a declining trend in terms of new democracies, and we see a global system which is not exactly effective, at least not in terms of, or if you compare it to a few years ago or decades ago. So that's, I thought that was pretty interesting. So the question, of course, is, so how do we engage with these trend lines? How do we try to impact the system to see it improve, and what can we do in order to sort of reform especially the architecture, the security architecture, to make it more responsive and more effective in order to, again, mitigate some of these trend lines? I think it's clear that there are reasons for concerns, and I think you've been very clear-eyed about the trends and why these trend lines are emerging. But I think the situation is not hopeless. So I think we need to distinguish between concerns and hopelessness. So I certainly agree that there are concerning elements here, but we need to be hopeful, I think, that we have an ability to impact some of these trend lines. For us, what's important is to just recognize that there is polarization, international polarization. There's a lack of trust, especially with for a lack of a better term, the global north and the global south. And this is impacting on the global institutions. It's difficult for these institutions to be effective. I think we see it most notably in the Security Council, the UN Security Council, where states are having a very difficult time collaborating and, of course, finding solutions to some of these problems that we're seeing, be it Ukraine, which, of course, is paralyzed because of Russia being a permanent member of the Security Council, and the Middle East, and especially the conflict in Gaza because of the U.S. and the vetoes exercised and put forward by the U.S. So from our vantage point, the Norwegian vantage point, what can we do to, again, try to mitigate some of these trend lines? I think reforming the security architecture, reforming these organizations, of course, is incredibly important. But that's a huge task. How do you reform the Security Council? But I think that needs to be one of the things that we are trying to aim for. And we also need to ensure more and better respect for international law. Because if you look at some of the problems that we're grappling with, these are so-called collective action problems. Climate change, regulating AI, cyber, space, reducing global transporter conflicts. These require global collaboration and global cooperation, and that can only happen through the development of new norms. So for us, what has been important is to try to approach these principles, to stick by our principles: democracy, human rights, respect for international institutions, respect for international law, and trying to avoid double standards. Because I think that's a really fundamental part of the problem. Lots of countries in the global south see the global north as being hypocritical. And I think if you look at, for instance, Ukraine and Gaza, this is very emblematic. You see, the US, the UK, the EU, and also Norway have been very clear-eyed about what's at stake in Ukraine. We've said we need to respect the UN Charter, we need to respect international law, we need to respect territorial integrity, we respect or protect civilians. And then the same issues come up in the context of Gaza, and then we start equivocating. We start being much more ambiguous about these terms, about these principles. And they pick up on that, and that's a problem. So that's why this government and Norway has tried to be very, very clear about protecting these principles and trying to and being very adamant about if we are serious about respecting international law, then we need to respect it in all kinds of contexts. So I think that's one of the things that we can do, and that needs to be I think at least our starting point. So I think I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, thanks. One follow-up question, Andreas, because you mentioned the stalemate, if you like, in the Security Council, the difficulty in getting the Security Council agreeing on peacekeeping operations, on new mandates for existing ones, on sort of finding solutions to current conflicts. To what extent can Norway also provide support for regional initiatives, regional organizations like the African Union in supporting peacekeeping operations? Can we see sort of that being an important strategy for trying to find regional, local solutions to conflicts to a greater degree than trying to circumvent the situation in the Security Council?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, and something that we have tried to prioritize is to have the African Union, for instance, to come in and take more responsibility for conflicts on their continent. And you see the African Union has, at least to a certain extent, stepped up, and they've allocated more resources, more military resources to some of these conflicts on the continent. But a big concern, of course, for Africa and the African continent, African states, South Africa, for instance, is that they're not represented. They're not, they feel, and which I think is understandable, that why is there no African state amongst the permanent five, the P5? So they're saying, all these conflicts, if you look at the agenda of the Security Council, they're dominated by African states, African situations. So you essentially have non-African states pronouncing on conflicts in Africa without the presence of African states. Of course, they are non-permanent members, so you have African states on the Security Council, but of course they have no veto power, and they're only there for 2 years, and then they rotate out, right? So that's a concern. So one of our priorities have, of course, been to support African states in terms of their request for reform of the Security Council, but that's a long-term agenda, because I think we all recognize that reforming the Security Council and making it more representative, that'll take a long time. So that's not a short-term fix. But I think you're absolutely right. We need to have Africa, and we need to have Asian states also taking more responsibility for conflicts in the region. And I think we have been, at least to a certain extent, making some progress. You see also now African states stepping up now, also outside Africa. Kenya is now deploying troops in Haiti, which is important. So there are positive developments, but of course it's challenging.
Thank you. Siri, I wanted to go back to you because we now presented the global conflict trends, but of course we're also at PRIO studying a number of other developments that can tell us something about the prospects for for peaceful or more peaceful developments, including how what we see in terms of trends when it comes to the ability of conflicts to to find solutions in terms of ceasefires, but also peace agreements, and there are some trends there as well. What can we say about sort of the global picture when it comes to ceasefires and to peace agreements?
So we collected data on ceasefires, and sort of the overall picture seems like from 1989 and up until like 2012-ish, about 1/3 of conflicts every year had a ceasefire. So 30% of the conflicts each year had a ceasefire. But then something happens, and this of course goes back to the graph I showed you in 2012, is that when we see the increase of conflict, the share goes down. So the number of ceasefires doesn't go down, but the share goes down, which indicates that something happens. And I think there's a couple of reasons why it seems like it's more difficult to solve conflicts. One is, of course, this IS effect that I talked about. IS is not the group that there are most ceasefires with. I don't think there is the easiest group to negotiate with. So that's one thing. Also, as I said, we have more conflict actors in the conflict countries, which makes the conflict landscapes much more complex. So even if you negotiate a peace agreement or a ceasefire with one group, you have other groups, you have splinters. So it becomes more complex. Also, as I indicated, we have these internationalized civil wars. So civil wars where you have another actor coming in. And as I mentioned, these are mostly foreign governments supporting the government, but not only. You also have foreign governments supporting the rebel groups. So, for example, in Ukraine, pre the current war, but when you have the civil war in the eastern Ukraine, you had Russia supporting the rebel groups. And most Ukrainians would not call this a civil war, they call it a proxy war, which is, I think it's a fair argument, but that's, so this also makes these conflicts more difficult to solve, because you also have external actors. So it is more difficult, I think, but we shouldn't be we should be hopeful as well. But I think that it's becoming more complex and more difficult to find the solutions.
Yeah. Paula, I want to turn to you because one of the motivations for PRIO in doing early warning systems is to try to find ways to inform policy about how we can make use of this information to try to prevent humanitarian crisis and assist humanitarian, the provision of humanitarian assistance. And can you say something about how use is working to achieve that?
Yes, that's a very good point. So we Views engages continuously with policymakers. So we have ongoing collaborations with a lot of UN agencies, including UNESCO, UNHCR, so the Agency for Refugees. And lately, we have been working with the FAO to give you a concrete example of what we could do. We have worked with the FAO to develop a conflict index, we call. So collaborating with them, we have been developing, it's an ongoing activity, a sort of an insurance scheme that mimics what scholars and practitioners have been doing in providing, for example, farmers with crop insurance mechanisms. But we would like to do this, and we are doing this for conflict. Basically establishing some sort of insurance scheme or a financial scheme that is triggered by a certain threshold in fatalities, so that if a conflict intensifies, there is some protection to farmers, but also to people on the ground. The purpose of this activity is to minimize the impact of conflict on food insecurity. So this is one example of ongoing activities, and potentially, of course, there are a lot of challenges in doing this, and one is ethical aspects, and we have been discussing how not to encourage exacerbating conflict to get the funding, and so we're very careful not to do that, of course. But a potential implication of this is that conflict is integrated in discussions of other insurance mechanisms. So we know that conflict, for example, exacerbates other impacts. And a lot of the conflict countries are also affected by droughts or floods or other climate extremes. And if the country is in conflict, it makes it very difficult to deal with and respond to the crisis. So this sort of insurance mechanisms that we're developing can be applied to also these compound risks. For example, increasing the crop insurance to farmers if this is a conflict country. And other activities include dashboards that we have developed, for example, for targeted UN agencies. And we continuously develop reports that are specific for regions of interest. For example, we have a Sahel predictive initiative that have forecasts for the Sahel region, and in collaboration with other institutes and on, for example, issues of migration and climate change.
And the index that we've been contributing to was presented to the G20 in June. So this is very much ongoing and implemented, being implemented as we speak. So it has a direct impact on how humanitarian assistance is provided by the Food and Agricultural Organization. We are nearing the end, but I wanted this to also say that research is also something that can contribute to inform ways that we can strengthen policies towards providing for both ways of de-escalating conflict, for preventing conflict from breaking out, but also to assisting populations in need during humanitarian situations. We need to wrap up. They're very strict on time here, but I also wanted Marianne quickly to say something about the sort of prospects now for mobilization. You mentioned the possibilities here. If there's ways that we can also take a positive spin. You mentioned the great social mobilization that is going on in a number of countries. What can we expect going forward?
Okay, so first I think it's a pretty good sign that people are willing to take to the streets and demand something better. So the will is definitely there. And there are probably many different reasons to why it's not working as efficiently as it used to. One possibility is that it's something about the way we are mobilizing today. That the spread of social media led to this rewiring of social movements. And that's something we can do something about. Or people in movements can do something about to instead of being, there are quite a few indications that being so dependent on social media is not providing the organizational backbone that these movements need. But we need more research to figure out how these movements can be more efficient, because that would definitely be a way that we could bring about a more democratic world.
Thank you. Andreas, any final words?
Well, I think every time I meet with the representatives of PRIO, it occurs to me that we need to have more conversations between policymakers and researchers about the empirical data that is driving some of these conflicts and what we can do to be effective in our responses. We had a meeting this morning about Afghanistan. I spoke to Christian, who was on the panel, so I learned from him and now from you. So I think that's one of the takeaways, that we need to collaborate more and really engage on ideas and be creative in terms of our responses. So that's one takeaway. I do think that it's important for us as policymakers to really stick to our principles and be adamant about upholding these principles of democracy, of human rights, of multilateralism and so forth. But I think we need to be much more sophisticated and smart in terms of how we advocate these principles to the global south. Because some of these countries, of course, are subscribing to the same principles, and they are extremely frustrated that they are run by authoritarian governments and so forth. So I think being smarter, being more effective, and collaborating closer between policymakers and researchers about trend lines and how to engage these trend lines, that's critical going forward. And I'm hoping that we can have more of these seminars. So thank you very much.
Absolutely, and encouraging also for the research community is that we have a leadership politically at the ministry who's both competent and interested in learning from research. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for following online. Feel free to sign up for news from PRIO and follow our research. Thanks to the panel, and have a good day.
Thank you. Excellent.